You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Well, hello. And welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we're going to do a bit of opinion scholarship. Going to get into a little bit more of the philosopher Walter Stace, Princeton philosopher, mystical fellow, interested in religion. So we have a lot in common. I want to apologize. Last week, I believe, I put episode 1 of this series on YouTube, and for some reason, no audio on that. The audio did not come through. Have no idea why. So those of you watching this on YouTube may have to go to the audio version of the podcast to listen to part 1. It's called Time and Eternity, season 3, episode 51. Today is episode 52 of season 3. I'm going to call this Time and Eternity part 2. All right. So maybe just a little bit of a recap is in order for the folks maybe just watching on YouTube. Last episode we got into Walter Stace. He talked about God, essentially. And he talked about it in a very philosophical way, very rigorous academic way, but also very mystical. He talked about one aspect of God he calls the negative divine. And today we're going to focus on the other aspect of God, the positive divine. What he means by negative and positive here is hard to describe, although we did a fairly good job in the first episode, and we'll kind of recap it today. But the idea of the negative God corresponds to this word non-being. You might be familiar with that from Eastern religions if you've got into any of that at all. This idea of non-being. It's closely associated with the idea of nothingness or the abyss, something that maybe you're familiar with biblically from the creation story, where in the beginning was the deep, right? The abyss. It's something. It's something that's not anything like what we understand when we think of a thing, or when we come up with a concept or the idea of a form. Anything that we experience in the world that's finite, which is everything that we experience, it's not like that. It's something else, right? It's non-being. It's not like being at all. It doesn't mean it's nothing. In fact, it might be the most important something. But that's not the only way of understanding God. You know, it's not just this static, infinite, unchanging reality, or whatever it is that underlies reality. It's that, but it's not just that. It's also being. It's also reality itself. It also has a positive component where you can point to something, or you can point to an experience and say, that's the thing, right? That's the positive divine. And that's what we're going to talk about today in more detail. So I'm going to call this first section the positive divine, the other half of the paradox. Okay, so I like to talk about God as a paradox. You guys have heard me talk about this ad nauseum, so I hate to repeat it too much, but just to set the stage, there's a symbolic idea that I first encountered reading Jordan Peterson, but it's an ancient idea. It goes back to the earliest religions, and it's something that's used in all sorts of ways in religious traditions all the way up to the present. But the idea is something like the symbol of the yin and yang, or what Jordan Peterson calls the Ouroboros. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, called it the syzygy. The idea here is the paradoxical union of opposites. And the image is of a serpent swallowing its own tail. It's a circle, so it represents infinity. There's no beginning, no itself represents the self. And it's the union of opposites. So if you think about the yin and the yang, it makes a bit more sense. The positive and the negative, being and non-being, but imagining them as one thing. And this is important in religious thinking. It's important in mysticism, which Walter Stace calls the origin of all religion. Is really ultimately this paradox, trying to understand how it can be that two opposite things can really be one. So without beating that horse, let me just jump right in to the positive divine. So Stace begins by saying, the characterization of the negative divine is that God is non-being. The positive divine that God is being. So this is an illustration of the union of opposites, the Ouroboros, like I was just explaining. God is both non-being and being. Well, non-being is exactly the opposite of being. It's everything that being cannot be. It's non-being. So how can it be that being and non-being are one thing? Clearly a paradox, clearly a head scratcher, a riddle. It's designed as a thought experiment that becomes a religious quest. When human beings ask themselves, how can it be that whatever God is can be both being and non-being? That starts you on the path to unraveling whatever this truth is, if it's possible to be unraveled. All right, Stacy goes on, he says, what predicates beyond existence does the positive concept attribute to him? By him, he means God. Basically what he's asking is, apart from saying God exists, I mean, existence is a positive attribute, right? So if God is both negative and positive, when we're focusing on the positive, what can we say about God that's positive? What can we say about God that is a fact or that is an attribute? What can we attach to this idea of God? Anything beyond existence, anything beyond being. And then he says to us that there's ample material in the traditions of world religions for answering this question. So what beyond existence can we attribute to God? And he answers, he says, God is a spirit, a mind. He is not matter, a psychological being, not a physical being. Spirit, mind, truth, love are all names of attributes, and so they imply concepts. But how can any concepts apply to God, who is above all concepts? This is the same as the problem, how can non-being also be being? Okay, so this was a huge focus on in the first episode when we're talking about the negative divine, that if we accept that God is something infinite or eternal, which is generally accepted worldwide, right? If God exists, it's attached to something like infinity or eternity. If that's the case, how can any concept, how can any thought encapsulate that infinite thing? It can't. So God is something that can't be understood through logic or imagination even. It's something that can't be understood through the intellect. It doesn't mean it can't be encountered. It just can't be understood. And so that's why we always come back around to this paradox. All right, he says, how can we conceptualize something that's beyond concepts? How can being be non-being? So this is the paradox. He goes on, he says, none of these apply to God in their literal meaning. They are all symbolic. Remember, he was saying mind, spirit, love, truth. These are things we can attach to that idea of God, but not literally. So these are all symbols. We can't literally attach spirit, mind, truth, and love to God, can we? And he explains, it is not literally true that God is love, if by love we mean the human emotion opposite of hate. Yet, in some way, this symbolic language evokes in us some glimpse of that being who stands above all concepts. Right? So to say that God is love isn't literally true, but there's something about that idea that God is love that gives you a glimpse of what God is. It's like there's something in common between this idea of God and this idea of love. They're not exactly synonyms. I can't say God equals love, which is what we're trying to do when we say God is love. It's not literally true, but there's something true about it. What is that? It's something that you know in intuition. It's not something you can put words to exactly. It says in some way, the symbolic language evokes in us some glimpse of that being who stands above all concepts. He says it is false to say either that God is love, or that he is hate, that he is mind, or that he is matter. And yet, it is truer to say that he is love than that he is hate, that he is mind than that he is matter. The negative divine expresses that all these words we use of God are false. The positive divine expresses that in spite of this, the words evoke in us some intuition of the divine. This is a great experiment. I mean, any religious person, I feel, from any background, who reads this sentence, it's not literally true that God is love or that God is hate. But it seems truer to say that God is love than to say that God is hate. How is that the case? How is that possible? What does that mean that we intuit? We feel drawn more towards equating God with love than with hate. There's something true about that. It's very difficult to argue with. We understand that intuitively, you know? So it's like secondhand knowledge. It's like beating around the bush knowledge. It's like finding those things that resonate with your intuition and gravitating towards them. It reminds me of what Jordan Peterson talked about when he talked about the spirit of Mercury, the mercurial spirit that flickers and flashes and it brings your attention to it. It's like we don't understand what it is that brings our attention to something, that makes us attracted to some idea, some event, some person. We have no idea what that is. It's similar here. We have no idea what it is that makes love seem more appropriate to attach to God than to hate. And yet, it is. Then he says, should we stop here? Or should we go on to say that God is not literally righteous, just, merciful, living, but that these two are merely symbols? What would we say if symbolic interpretation were pushed to its furthest possible point, and it were alleged that even to attribute existence to God is a mere symbol? Should we not feel that God had evaporated altogether? This question is in fact crucial for religion. Okay, so when we're trying to attach any positive attribute, if we're trying to associate any concept at all with God, we can say things like spirit, mind, and things like that. We can say love. We can say things that make some sense to us. But we understand that that's not literal. That's somehow symbolic. There's something about spirit, mind, love that we can associate with God. There's some thread in common, but they're not identical things, are they? I don't think so. And we can't say either that God is literally righteous, just, merciful, living. Can we even say that God exists literally? Or is that symbolic too? Is there some thread in this idea of existence that also runs through this idea of God? They're not identical, something in common though. And the reason this question is crucial for religion is because it implies a deeper question. Does reality transcend existence? Does reality transcend creation? Is there something real that isn't captured by the laws of physics and the space-time manifold that we exist in, and energy and matter and quantum fields? Is there some reality beyond that? And can we say that is real? And it's associated with something symbolic. It's like it reminds you of this Platonic realm of forms, or this realm of spirit, or this realm of the gods that we hear about from our religious stories. There are symbols that exist, like Plato's forms. There are essences that exist in this realm of forms. What is that? We have no idea. It's like there's a perfect idea, and then there's the reality. The perfect sphere, and then a basketball that we see in reality. It's like, well, there's some connection between these two things. But one of them exists only in my mind, and one of them exists for real. And the question is, does the thing that exists only in my mind have some reality? It's not material, it's not physical, it's not real in some sense, but it is real. It's an idea in my mind. It's an idea in your mind. So is it possible that there is that reality extends beyond what we generally accept? And if so, what does that mean? That's the religious question. He says, it is of the essence of a mind to move, to change, to be active. It is a stream of conscious states in time. If we say that this is not true of God's mind, we have abandoned the literal interpretation of God as a mind. What we have here is a case of the contradiction between the negative divine and the positive divine. It is part of the positive divine to affirm the creative activity which results in the existence of the world. Right? God is doing something, right, when he creates the world. But it is an essential part of the negative divine that God is wholly inactive. Right? It's that static, unchanging reality behind reality. Both the dynamic and the passive are equally necessary elements in the religious consciousness. The one corresponds to being, the other to the non-being of God. Then he says the same conflict of the active and passive. See, and you can see these opposites, this Ouroboros here, this idea of the active and the passive together. He says the same conflict of the active and the passive causes the Greek splitting of the divine into God and the demiurge, the latter to exercise the creative activity. So if you don't know this idea of the demiurge, it's something that appears in Platonism, but it's also something that appears in early Christianity and the Gnostic tradition. And it just means that according to their mythology, that God, the great divine being, whatever that is, the unknowable being, creates something. That something is the creator God, the God that goes off to create the world. So what this does is it gives distance between God and the act of creation. It allows God, this high God, the God behind the demiurge, it allows him to be inactive. It allows him to be this unchanging fundamental reality. And it proposes this secondary God who then does all the work. And so the Greeks can maintain the idea of a passive God and an active God. And that's the idea. That's another Ouroboros symbol. Of course, the Gnostics believed that the demiurge was worshipped by most Christians and Jews, that it was sort of a false god, that the God behind God is the one that deserves our worship and so forth. The demiurge almost becomes a demonic type of a figure. But this idea of a God behind God is fascinating to me. It makes me think of Carl Jung's description of archetypes as living spirits, but they exist in something called the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is the thing that makes archetypes possible. It's the thing that makes those spirits possible. So the spirits themselves might be thought of as gods, and the death psychologists made that connection. They thought that the classical pantheon of, let's say, Greek and Roman gods all represented archetypal spirits, personalities and motivational forces that human beings all possess. But the thing that makes them possible is like the God behind the God, the archetype behind the archetypes. And there's an idea that I've talked about before. I just want to insert this because I think it's fascinating, that Zoroastrianism, this ancient Persian religion that actually Christianity owes a lot to, but most people aren't aware of this faith at all, even though it was one of the great world religions. They believe that God is sort of this twofold thing, Ahura Mazda, the God of good, you might say. I know that's a simple, the God of evil called our myths. There's a God behind those two gods. It's called Zurvan. Or in the Indo-Iranian religions that are related to Zoroastrianism. For instance, the religion of the Scythians, it's called Tabiti. Right? So you have this, Tabiti is this eternal fire that it pre-exists everything, from which the first two primordial gods are birthed, heaven and earth, very much like what we see in the Greek religion, where heaven and earth are the first two created gods, Uranus and Gaia. All right, back to Walter Stace. He says, it follows that all propositions about God are false if they are understood literally. This will apply to the proposition God exists, as well as to the proposition God does not exist. So this is how he answers what he called this fundamental religious question. God is above both existence and non-existence. So you can say that it's both true and false that God exists. Both are true and both are false. The reality is something that transcends even this idea of existence. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call Symbols Are a Bridge. Stacy says, there is a condition which attaches to all metaphor, myth, allegory, analogy, that both the symbol and that which it symbolizes should be present to the mind. If this is not the case, the symbolism becomes meaningless, and both terms must be in some way known. Okay, so this makes perfect sense to you. If you were to open up an encyclopedia of religious symbols and you flip it up to a random page and you point at an image, chances are you have no idea what that image means. It's a symbol that has meaning, but you don't know that meaning. And so the symbol, it really ceases to be a symbol. It's a pretty picture, right? It's a pretty picture at that point. It doesn't have meaning to you because you don't understand what reality it stands for. A symbol stands for some reality. For a symbol to be meaningful, you have to understand the reality and you have to understand the symbol simultaneously. Only when you know that the symbol means the reality does the symbol have any meaning or any utility. That's all he's saying here. So God is a symbol or as an abstraction of something that's not entirely knowable. It does have a meaning. And in fact, it's understood easily. Even to children. If you were to sit down and you were to talk to a toddler, or a kid in early elementary school, maybe sophisticated enough to understand the idea, and you explain to them or ask them the question, it maybe goes something like this: where did you come from? I came from mommy and daddy. Where did they come from? Grandma and grandpa. Where did they come from? I don't know. Well, you can continue to go back and go back and go back. And eventually you're going to hit some beginning point. And even a child can understand that whatever that beginning point is what we mean when we say God. So the symbol, this word God, and the meaning have to both be there. And what's interesting is that it seems to be there. It seems to be there in our capacity for reason and logic. Like even a child can deduce such a thing without having any real experience of God, with having first encountered that idea. There's something interesting about that, something Stacy calls like the inheritance of being human, that having a religious instinct or impulse or capacity is something that is uniquely human and something we all share. And that explains why religion is everywhere in all of human history. All right, Stacy says, it is not necessary that the meaning of symbolic language be clearly before the mind. It may only be apprehended in the borderlands of consciousness. The symbol helps us to drag it into the light of consciousness, to make it clearer. The symbol stands in the place of a clear understanding of it. Okay, so what he's saying is we do have to have some idea of what this concept is, what this reality is, and the symbol simultaneously for us to be able to use that symbol, for it to be meaningful, for it to be a symbol. But that reality that we're pointing to with the symbol, it doesn't have to be clearly understood. It can be vaguely understood. It can be suspected, right? And the moment we have the symbol to concentrate on, it's almost like what he says, we're pulling that information up from our unconscious to make it conscious. It's like the symbol it facilitates the filling in of this sort of outline. He says the symbol helps us drag it into the light of consciousness. And in the meantime, the symbol stands in place of a clear understanding of it. So a symbol is a bridge between something we don't understand and something we do. He says, there must be directly present to the mind the actual nature of the Godhead, as well as the symbol itself. Otherwise, the symbolism will be empty. It is only to the conceptual intellect that the road to God is barred. It is not the case that God cannot be apprehended at all. He reveals himself not negatively, but positively in intuition. The symbolic proposition about God represents the mystical experience itself. It is not a proposition about God which is symbolized, but God himself as he is experienced. In the mystical vision, the experience is actually present to the mind. When symbolic language provides a hint of the nature of God, what is happening is that the symbol stands before the intellect, while God himself is directly present to intuition. Isn't that interesting? While the symbol stands before the intellect, it's not possible to conceptualize God because God is beyond all concepts. God is infinite, concepts are finite. So I can look at a symbol and it stands to my intellect, representing some reality that I cannot comprehend. But I can't experience that reality. This is what he's suggesting when he's talking about the mystical experience, to have an experience of God, or more precisely, an experience of being God, of being one with God, that sort of thing. This is what the religious experience is. He says it is not a proposition about God, but God himself as he is experienced. God cannot be understood intellectually, but can be experienced. And when you experience God, when you have that mystical experience, you're holding before your mind the experience of being God. And that makes the symbol alive. It makes the symbol have real meaning. And this is sort of a heightened experience, this mystical experience we're talking about, becoming God and having that ego death experience or that unitive experience that people talk about. But it's not the only way. I mean, it may be the case, and I think it is the case, that all experience is something like this mystical experience. Mystical experience is some sort of a peak or pinnacle experience, but all experience is something like this mystical experience. In fact, idealist philosophers, and I have some sympathy with them, feel like the world is symbolic. The world is representational, like words or pictures are representational. And when what we experience day to day is an experience of secondhand, of these representations, what they represent is never experienced, or maybe only in that mystical vision. And we'll get to that in a little bit more. This is the idea that the world or experience is somehow illusory. It's somehow not quite real. And this is a common refrain. This is something that people commonly report after having a mystical experience. Everything that used to seem like the beginning and end of reality now seems less real by comparison to this other experience. I've experienced something more real, and so everything else seems to be somehow false. And that's what I mean when I say that idealist philosophers and idealist religions will often think about our waking, sober reality as an experience of only symbols, of only representations, never the fundamental reality itself. This is the ones and zeros behind the matrix that we don't ever see. And that brings me to my next section, which I'm going to call God and the World, Time and Eternity. All right, Stacy tells us there are two distinct orders of being, the order of time and of eternity. God is not one thing among others, standing in relation to them, for this would involve his otherness to them and would destroy his infinity. It will be said that this implies a God who stands in no relation to the world at all. But if the world is other than God, God is limited by the world and is not infinite. All right, so there's some logic games here, and I think everybody who's searching, everybody who's on a religious quest has these sorts of arguments with themselves, these sort of logic games that we're playing. And he's talking about two distinct orders, the finite and the infinite, the order of time and the order of eternity. You can think about that as the realm of spirit and the realm of matter. You could make that same analogy. And he says, God is not one thing among many others, standing in some relation to them. God is eternity. He's the thing to which there is no other. He is the all-encompassing oneness. He's everything, the whole kit and caboodle. So to understand God that way doesn't leave room for relationships. It doesn't make room for otherness. There is no other. There is no anything outside of God or apart from God. God encompasses it all. It is the one. That's what that means. Oneness and eternity are the same. They imply the same thing here. This is why he says otherness would destroy his infinity. Why? If the world stands outside of God as something God created, then it's not within God. That means there's something outside of God. And that makes him not infinite. That makes him not the thing to which there is no other. Because there is something other. Right? So allowing any of this is undermining God as being infinite. And like we said when we first started, infinity is something that goes part and parcel, hand in hand with this idea of God. You know, you really can't have one without the other. So what does that mean? He says a causal relation between God and the world has been the most common conception. It is implied by the doctrine of creation. And this resonates with me. He says God is the cause, the world the effect. This, however, destroys the infinity of God, since in any causal relation, the effect is other than the cause. And I think this, for me, this is the argument that is the most powerful. This is the argument that allowed me to start thinking differently about God. So we think about God as creator, and creation then being the product of God. And so it's separate from God. It's other than God. God is the perfect eternal thing. Creation is the flawed, imperfect, finite thing. How can they be one thing? This is the question. How can being be non-being? How can creator and creation be one thing? How? And he reminds you that if creation and creator are different things and stand apart from each other, this destroys the infinity of God. Because cause and effect are two separate things. God, of course, is not. And so this is what I mean. This allowed me to start thinking about God as both creator and creation. How can it be that God is both? Not creator standing, hovering in the heavens, staring back down at the cosmos. Not that image at all. Like God looking out from within the cosmos, right? Something like that. Like how can creator and creation be one thing? And if they can be one thing, there's something there, something valuable there. Stacy says, the natural order is the order of time, and the divine order is the order of eternity. In the moment of mystic illumination, the two orders intersect so that the moment belongs to both orders. But we have to suppose that in some way, every moment of time is an intersection of the divine order with the natural order. The divine order must intersect the temporal order at every moment of time and at every point in space. This is demanded by the intuition of the omnipresence of God. So God is not just eternal, but everywhere, all right? It must be every moment, every space, something like that. So let me circle back to where we started. He says, in the moment of mystic illumination, so this is that mystical one with the universe experience, this religious experience that it's possible to have. He says, in that experience, you have an intersection between the natural order and the divine order, between time and eternity, between creation and creator. You have an intersection in that mystical experience between the two. And I think that's true. And then he says something else. He says, but we have to suppose in some way every moment is like this, not just this mystical experience. Every moment is the intersection of the divine and the natural order. I like to think of this analogy. I like to think of the natural order, this idea of being, as the clay figure of Adam that God forms in the book of Genesis. And the divine order is the Ruach Adonai. It's the breath of God, the soul of God that gets breathed into Adam and brings it to life. So the order of time, or this order of being we're talking about, is like the form. And then the divine part is what is breathed into it that brings it to life. And so reality is like that. Reality is like an incarnation. Everything is filled with a spirit that makes it alive. And you might argue that not everything is alive, but I would disagree in some ways, and I think Walter Stace is going to disagree as well, using the words of Alfred North Whitehead in a moment. We'll talk about that in a second, which is fascinating. So the divine, everything is an intersection between the divine order and the natural order. Reality seems to require both the form and the spirit that animates it, you know? And then when he says that the divine order must intersect the temporal order at every moment and in all space, and that's demanded by his omnipresence, this reminds me of something that was sort of a message that I received in my own mystical experience, where I came back from wherever I was, this mystical sort of experience, came back into my normal state of consciousness. And what I remember thinking to myself over and over and over, and that's what made it seem like a message, that's how these things are with me, that the magic that I saw in that mystical experience that I was fascinated with, in awe of, that I was desiring more than anything else, that magic is all around me all the time. It's in my waking reality. It's in the here and now, in material reality, in the natural order, in my friends and family and nature and all that. I have to learn to see the magic from the mystical experience in my waking reality. I have to learn to see everything as God, because that's what it felt like in the mystic experience. And it felt like it was more real than real. So when I come back to my sober reality, I have to learn to see my sober reality in the light of that truth. And I'm still working on that. It's not something I've achieved. I'm still working on that. But when he says we have to suppose that in some way, every moment of time is an intersection of the divine order and the natural order, that's what it reminded me of. My own sort of message, that I interpret that as God speaking to me. And there are no words, it's just that's how it comes through, like a preoccupation of my consciousness that I don't have control over. It's like, wait a minute, something's trying to bring my attention to this. What is this? I better stop and pay attention. What is this? And the message is, learn to see the magic that you saw in the mystic experience in the world around you, because it is there. There is no difference. All right, Stacy says, as the mystic sees it, that moment is infinite and eternal. Looked at from normal consciousness, it is a moment of time. From within, it is God. From without, right, it just looks like a normal moment. In that experience, in that normal moment, you experience eternity. And so Stacy quotes William Blake, who says, to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Whew, buddy, hair on my arms standing up. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call What is Real? All right, Stacy says, all philosophies which declare that time, space, and the world are unreal or half real, appearances or illusion, have their roots in mysticism. When he says mysticism, he's talking about this mystical experience, this unitive, one with the universe experience we're talking about. He says it derives from the mystical vision of the eternal moment outside of which there is no other, and therefore no world, no space, no time. when the mystic passes back from the order of eternity into the order of time, the world, which has been a total illusion, reappears and forces itself upon him. Yet the memory and influence of that tremendous moment are still upon him and cause him to attribute to the world a shadowy half-reality. Hence arises the notion of degrees of reality, which is so common in philosophies like those of Vedanta, Bradley, and Hegel. Only the ultimate, which is the content of the pure mystic moment, is absolutely real. Other things are more or less real according as they are nearer or further away from the divine order. Now, this isn't exactly the way I would say it, but I understand the meaning. Once you've experienced that ultimate reality, once you've experienced that mystical moment, you have an understanding of what it means to be real that's different from what you trusted 100% based on all of your life experience up to that moment. Like what I used to think was real and what I think now can't be reconciled with one another. And when I come back to this older real, I realize by contrast, it doesn't seem quite real. It isn't as real, as definitive as I once thought. And it makes you question whether there is reality to this world of this phenomena world, this world of appearance, how things seem. There is a difference, we know, between how things seem and how things are. The question is, do we ever experience how things are? Stacy says, if the divine order is brought down into the natural order and supposed to be a part of it, then a contradiction arises. This confusion of taking the eternal order for a part of the natural order is the source of the whole conflict between science and religion. For as soon as the divine is put within the natural order, it cannot be found there, and so its reality is denied. All right, a couple things here. When he says, if the divine order is brought down into the natural order, I can't help but think of this image of incarnation, of the God-man, right? The divine order coming down into the natural order. That's like, Christ being born, the God-man being born in a human form. It reminds me of the incarnation. Now, when that happens, then you get naive religious people who will say things like, if God was on earth, how could God be in heaven? Like, where is God the Father while Jesus is manifested on the earth? This is the whole, mystery around the Trinity, that kind of a thing. If God is not in heaven, if God is part of the natural order, then there is no God, because we look around the natural order and we do not find it. We do not find the infinite thing. We do not find the transcendent thing. Why is that? Because it's not real, or because the natural order is not where it is to be found? The natural order is only half of the paradox of reality. The other half, the eternal order, the non-being, the God part, that's not to be found in physics. The fact that it's not to be found in physics does not make it not real. And this was illustrated best by David Chalmers, who spoke about consciousness not supervening on the physical. He said, it is a mystery consciousness. If there's anything that we can associate with spirit, that would be it. It's a reality that we cannot deny because we are conscious, right? But it cannot be found, it cannot be pointed to, it cannot be explained by the laws of physics. So there is a reality beyond, and our being conscious is the proof of that. All right, Stacy says, how God can be in the human heart, we know from our own inner experience. But how is God in a stone? All right, so we're talking about God being everything. So he says we can understand God being within us somehow. We kind of understand what we mean when we say God is in the hearts of men, understanding God as spirit and so forth, human beings having an animated spirit, something like that seems okay. We can kind of grapple with that. But to ask, where is God in a stone? He says pantheism, which means all is God, he says is an error, that God is only in the world, and that he is not transcendent of it. So there are people that believe pantheistic ideas, like whatever God was, whatever this creative thing was, the singularity, whatever it might be, became the universe. So when we're looking for God, we're not going to find anything transcendent outside of the universe. The universe itself used to be the transcendent thing, and it has become the immanent thing. God has become physically the laws of nature and physics and material reality, energy and matter and time and space. That's what God is. And he says this is an error. It's actually kind of a beautiful concept, but there's something wrong about it. Because what it does is it removes this idea of the transcendence of God altogether. It's like that poof went away when it transformed into the immanent reality. Non-being went away when it turned into being. Right? Then you have a lopsided thing. You've lost this paradox that started where you started from. He says, God is immanent everywhere, but he is also transcendent. It seems probable that, as the panpsychic philosophy of Whitehead has suggested, so now we're talking again about Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of organism, he calls it. He says, there is no distinction, except one of degree, between the organic and the inorganic. So there is no distinction between the organic and the inorganic, between the living and the not living. He says the common thread running throughout is life. All things are living. This is what Whitehead believed. All things are living. Even an electron is a very low-grade organism. So the essence of every being is experience. What a being is something that can experience or something that can be experienced. So this is the common thread. He says the essence of every being is experience. Although in the pre-animal levels, the experiences are unconscious. It's an interesting idea. Imagine something that you would think of generally as being not living. But imagine that thing as having experiences unconsciously. I like to think about, if we go back to the electron example, when energy is infused into the electron or into the atom, the electron will move up into different orbitals. When the energy is dispersed, they'll fall back down. So you can see electrons interacting with each other, or electrons having this shift in orbitals. If that sort of a change, that sort of an interaction, if it were a living being, if it were a conscious being, and we kind of agreed on that, you would say there must be an experience of that. There must be something it's like for an electron to jump up into a different orbital. There must be something it's like for an electron to bump into another one and have some sort of reaction, exchange energy or whatever happens. I don't know. I'm not a physicist. So this is what he's saying here. He's like, even the electron is having experience, but when the thing is not living, it's an unconscious experience. And I think this is fantastic because it lines up so well with what the depth psychologists say and what they point to in like parallels in mythology, that the unconscious is the symbol of this, or is symbolized by this primordial God figure, the Zervan figure, the Tabiti figure we were talking about earlier, the God behind God that starts it all off. This is the unconscious. This is the abyss. This is the realm of potential, the realm of spirit, the thing that makes all being possible. And what comes from the unconscious, according to the depth psychologists, is consciousness itself. Consciousness is born from the unconscious. Being is born from non-being. And to see this tact that Walter Stace takes, to me, is interesting. The essence of every being is experience. Although in the pre-animal levels, the experiences are unconscious. The fact that in the virus, we have a being which exhibits some of the characteristics of the organic and some of the inorganic suggests that it is not possible to draw a sharp line between the two. Right? A virus gives us an example of something that's sort of living and sort of not. And so we know just by the existence of this thing, the virus, there isn't a way for us to draw a sharp line between the organic and the inorganic, between the living and the non-living. And so it may be that all things are living, all things are experiencing. He said, we may then well suppose that what we call the deadness of inorganic existence is but a deep hypnotic sleep of their consciousness. It may well be that the life of the plant is but a level of the hypnotic sleep of consciousness lower than is ever found in the animal, and that in the metal and the rock, the darkness is deeper still. But even there, an unconscious mentality exists. And there too, perhaps, the eternal moment awaits, that evolutionary liberation from the darkness, which has already come to mystic man. Whew, buddy, what he's suggesting there is that this process of evolution, you can see this a lot like the idea of reincarnation and perfecting the soul as you move towards moksha or move towards nirvana in the Eastern religions. But imagine it's not you as a man that's going through this process of rebirth and perfection so that you can escape into heaven or into the world beyond it, incarnation. Imagine if you're an electron that makes up a stone. And what you're doing is waiting in this unconscious place for evolution to turn you into a living being or to turn you into something capable of recognizing that it too is God. The same way we as human beings recognize that in mystic intuition, that everything that exists is in a process of moving towards that eventuality, the recognition that you are God. It's amazing, amazing. And that brings me to my next section. My last section here is called The Meeting of Worlds. So to begin, I want to remind you of the idea of incarnation we talked about just a moment ago, where the divine order comes down to the natural order. You get this symbol of God becoming man. And maybe you see that same thing in creation, God becoming the universe or the cosmos or what have you. And this is the idea of worlds meeting. I can't help but picture the centerpiece of the Sistine Chapel. If you guys know that picture, it's robed God reaching out his finger and naked Adam opposite him reaching out his finger. And they're just almost touching, just not quite, but almost touching. And it's supposed to represent this idea of the natural order, the divine order coming together, interacting, and it's this idea of incarnation. So Stacy begins like this. He says, what is the meaning of the metaphor of intersection? Intersection means precisely what the eternal moment is experienced to be. It is one and the same consciousness which experiences the natural world and the eternal order, which is disclosed in mystical illumination. In that experience, there is no subject and no object. And the mystic is therein identical with God. In itself, the eternal moment is single, for it is the one God. It is the one self-identical point, which is everywhere, coextensive with the universe. Man, oh man. So in the mystic experience, subject and object go away. They meld into each other, right? You have this unifying experience and all the distinctions and separation and differences go away. So subject and object come together. And what that means is, right, you are generally the subject and what you're experiencing is generally the object. But when what you're experiencing is God, there is no distinction between subject and object. You become God. One with God, one with all, one with the universe. That's what happens. And he says, in itself, the eternal moment is single, for it is the one God. And I didn't put this quote in here, but in the book, he also says that the mystic experience is the experience of being God. And everyone is capable of having a mystic experience. So you can imagine if everybody's having that mystical experience, everybody is becoming God. It's not that everybody's becoming their own God. It's that everybody is becoming the same God. The mystical experience is identical between you and I and everyone else. This is how it unifies everything. This is what it feels like. This is what your intuition tells you when you've had this experience and you're reflecting on it. I think that this is the origin of monotheism, that this unitive feeling of being one with God and there being one God, God being all. I think this is where monotheism comes from. Like, Stacy is not shy about saying that mystical experience, he believes, is the root of all religious traditions, which I agree with. But to say specifically that this experience provides the intuition that becomes monotheism, the idea that there's only one God, I don't see any other possibility. He says, God and the world are both two and one, distinct and identical. So again, we have this paradox. He says, we find this in all those philosophies which have their source in mysticism. In Bradley's metaphysics, the absolute has nothing outside it. Nevertheless, the absolute is different from the world. In the Vedanta, Brahman both is and is not the world. In the philosophy of Spinoza, the attributes which are the world constitute the substance, and yet substance is something other than the attributes. The question of the relation of God to the world is, after all, a question. It employs concepts. Okay, remember what we said about concepts. We can't capture God in a concept. So he says, hence the answer to all theological problems is either silence or metaphors. And the true answer is the silence which is God himself. In other words, the answer lies in the experience, not in a concept. Now we're going to move to metaphor. He says, metaphor has the power to evoke the experience, to draw it up from the subliminal towards the upper layers of consciousness. This is why mystics, though they say their experience is ineffable, speak to us of it in many words. They seek to evoke a meaning which is already in us. All right, so this is fantastic as far as I'm concerned. When he says a meaning that's already in us, but something we haven't recognized, he's talking about something that's unconscious and latent in us. And he says metaphor has the ability to encourage or draw that meaning up out of us. And he says to draw it up from the subliminal, which is like the subconscious, towards the upper layers of consciousness. And this is something Carl Jung said. Carl Jung said that our job is to make the unconscious conscious. There's treasures to be found there. There's God to be found there. There's answers to be found there. There's meaning to be found there. So we go into the unconscious and we bring up with us, and we go into the underworld, as they say mythologically, and we bring the treasure back, whatever that is, into the light of consciousness. Now, metaphor, and religious symbols, they're designed to do exactly this, to help us to see the meaning which is already in us, to help us to bring this experience of God to the surface. And that brings me to my conclusion. Okay. So the paradox between being and non-being, between the positive and negative divine, that old chestnut, is the religious mystery. Whether we frame it as the infinite and finite, the immanent and transcendent, the actual and potential, matter and spirit, we're speaking of the paradoxical union of opposites. What Ian McGilchrist called the coincidence of opposites. We cannot have one without the other. They come together or not at all. But this does something strange. It takes two things which are as different as it's possible to be, and it makes them, paradoxically, one. How can this be? What does it mean that it's true? It means that we experience distinctions which do not exist. And if we do this, then we experience a reality which does not exist, or at least not merely in the way we perceive it. What does this imply? Could it be that what we call real extends beyond what can be perceived, beyond what can be conceived? This is the idea of the negative divine. It is God understood as the reality behind and beyond our perceptions. The reality which is infinite and therefore cannot be fitted within a finite concept. It is therefore unknowable. But this does not mean that it must remain a mystery forever out of our reach. The idea of the positive divine provides a bridge. We can understand this by focusing on God as being. So this is the positive aspect. If God is being, it is somehow the world and the people and objects within it. It is creation in the religious parlance. So we can understand all our experiences as direct experiences of God. This is what Stace means when he says we have to suppose that in some way every moment is an intersection of the divine order with the natural order. But there is more. Our connection with the positive divine is not limited to finite experience. Our human inheritance includes the possibility for yet another kind of experience, a religious or mystical experience. This is an experience of the infinite. While God as infinity is beyond concepts, it is not beyond experience. This is the religious instinct that Stace calls knowing by being. In mystic experience, we know God because we are God. In the infinite experience, the paradox is resolved. Subject and object meld together, and we remember, like it's some long forgotten truth, that we are and have always been this infinite divine unity. When we return from this mythological trip to the underworld, from this voyage into the unconscious, when we return from the kingdom of heaven and are pulled back again into our unique individuality, we bring with us a great mystery and a great treasure. We are, of course, unable to share it since words are insufficient for the task. But how can we not share such a thing? How can we not wish this blessing on everyone? How can we not share this truth, which seems more significant than anything? We can't. And so the mystics of the world write their hymns and prayers and holy texts. They preach and evangelize and teach. They are the guides and prophets, gurus and sages of human history right up to the present. They conceal the infinite in symbols, which attempt to bridge the gap between worlds. God, Tao, Nirvana, and Moksha. These ideas are Jacob's ladder. They lead the way if you should but choose to climb. As Jesus said, knock, and it shall be opened.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored. But in